So we thought we'd have just a little discussion about some of the other pots of money that may be around. Obviously, we've heard about NIHR and some of their fellowships and their project grant schemes as well. So we thought we'd look elsewhere. So we're going to talk about the different types of funding available and what you might be looking for. And how you can find those funding options, because in a way there's an absolute plethora of information and it's how you make your way through that. And then we can stop and have a little Q&A at the end if that's helpful. So the kind of funding that you will need will very much depend on what stage you are at. So as we know, some of you haven't yet finished your PhD. Some of you have and may be a little bit further down the line and might be building up your CV. And it also depends where your research is at. So are you working in an area where there's really not a lot known and you still need to sort of gather information or do systematic reviews? Or are you at the stage where you know exactly what you need to do next and you have a nice contained project that's staring you in the face? You also need to think about what is it you actually need funding for. So golden opportunity, can you get yourself some funding to actually write an application, which is kind of a bit the gold standard perhaps to try and get hold of that. Are you at the point where actually you could do with some kind of small grant to do a bit of pilot work or some kind of review? Do you know that you're looking for a project or a fellowship? Or actually, are you trying to do some dissemination of your work, perhaps a bit beyond what you've been able to do within your project? So we'll talk about all of those things. And a bit of a caveat to the talk is that lots of these are kind of examples. Lots of them are based very specifically within the South Central area because that's where all of you are from. And you may well know and find loads and loads of other opportunities. But these examples will tell you the kinds of things that you might be looking for. So hopefully many of you will have come across the applied research collaborations, which is another bit of NIHR. And they are spread around the country, but there is one in Southampton and there's another one in Oxford. And they are divided into themes. So it's quite important perhaps for you to work out whether your research fits into any of their themes, because they are a brilliant kind of group to get involved with if you can. And one of the particular things that they are tasked with doing is around research capability and capacity. So they are very much there to help researchers sort of move on in research careers. And they would probably be delighted if you are knocking on their doors saying that you are a willing and interested researcher. So they are a good source potentially if the work that you're doing aligns with the themes that they're interested in. So, for example, in Southampton, they have Research Enhancement Awards, which would buy out your time for a day a week, just for 6 months. And that might help you get you going in your next stage of your ideas. Maybe that would be to write an application. Maybe it would be to get some training done, those kind of things. So sort of short and contained, but might be just enough to really get you going on your next stage. Another good option is your local NHS trust. And again, they have all sorts of different options that might be available to you. I don't know whether you'll have heard of the research capability funding, but that is a pot of money that comes down to NHS trusts that are research active. And it's up to individual trusts to decide how they spend that money. So it's quite important to go and talk to your local R&D office to find out what happens in your trust and whether there are any opportunities there that you might be able to avail yourself of some funds. So for example, in Southampton, they're trying very much to grow what they're calling chief investigators and principal investigators. And as a result, they've recently set up a couple of schemes specifically for those groups. And so they're really trying to channel a bit of resource towards those groups, and that would buy out their time and try and get them going with some work that is absolutely their own that will help build their CVs. So that's an example of something that UHS is pursuing, but other trusts will have other ideas of how they want to spend that money. So again, it's very much worth going out there and talking and making links with your R&D office. It's always really important to know what's going on in your own R&D office anyway. And another option, again, NIHR, is your local biomedical research centres. So again, these are very much based around themes. So it's important for you to know where are the research centres that are doing the kind of work that you align with. Again, there's one in Oxford, a huge one in Oxford. There's another one in Southampton. So do check the kind of themes that they are. You see, Oxford's so good, it's got two. So well worth seeing whether any of the work that you're doing aligns with them. For example, in Southampton, they have a postdoc bridging fellowship. So that's very much trying to keep people on that research track, and so they don't drop off once they've completed their PhD. So it's worth finding out what kind of schemes BRCs are involved with that you might be able to tap into. And Oxford has postdoctoral award priority, and they prioritise AHPs, nurses and midwives. So they're really, really looking out for that group in particular, all of you. So we've said there might be a number of routes that you want to go down, and one might be that you've come to the end of your PhD, but actually that doesn't lead directly onto something really big. You might know that you need to do a bit more, maybe some pilot work or finding out a bit of information. So what you need next is a kind of what we would call a smaller pot of money to do that one discrete bit of work. So often a really good source is to go and look at your professional body. So, so we've listed those, but you may have another one. I don't know if there's one for music therapy, but it would be worth finding out what they have available for research. And again, it varies a lot. So some will be quite well set up and they will have specific calls that will come out on a time scale. Others will be more ad hoc and they might do them once in a blue moon. So it's really worth checking out your own professional body to see what they have available. And again, I'm sure it's very good for them to get to know your name anyway and know that you are around and are research interested. So charities, far, far, far too many to list. But what's listed here are just some of the big ones. And again, things like Diabetes UK will have a really standard kind of 3 calls a year type scheme, and they'll have all sorts of different possibilities with various sizes of funding pots. As you can see, specifically, they do have one for nurses, midwives and AHPs, quite a small pot of 15k. And so do some of the others having what they call pump priming. So it's really worth looking around to see what might be available, whether they're based on a sort of disease specific charity or something that's looking very specifically for a profession. So always worth having a little look around to see what's available that fits in with your work and research interests. And again, back to your NHS trusts. We've talked about research capability funding, but there are some other pots around as well. So, for example, Southampton has a small grant scheme and Oxfordshire also has a research grant scheme. And you can see very varied, one 1k, one 50k. So if you know that what you want to go for is a bit of project funding, obviously we've already heard about research for patient benefit and research for social care. But again, all sorts of other places, but these are just 2 big categories that are worth investigating. Charities, again, as you can see, some of them become really quite big amounts of money, and that might be when you're really going out there and doing your full randomized controlled trial type studies, and others will, have a really wide range. So do familiarize yourself with how often those calls come out. Sometimes, as I say, they're really ad hoc. So you might not have one for 18 months while the charity is sort of thinking about its own priorities, and then it'll pop up. So it might be worth trying to get alerts from places that are of particular interest and align with your interests. And again, some professional bodies will have specific project grants too. So Royal College of Occupational Therapy does, as long as you are aligned with the research priorities that they particularly have, and the RCN Foundation. So they've currently got priorities on children and young people's mental health. So worth having a look into. So it may be that you know that what you really want to do is get a personal fellowship. So that's very much about a funder investing in you as an individual. We've heard about the NIHR fellowship scheme, so that gives loads and loads of scope. And I'm not paid to say this, but they are particularly good because as well as funding your salary and your project, there's a whole bit about training. So they're really generous, they're very competitive, very prestigious. So different fellowships will have different rules about what they include in their funding. So it may just fund the research itself, but not your salary. And you'll just need to check and see what fits with what you can afford to do, what you would, what kind of resources you need to get at. So again, some of these are big ones like the British Heart Foundation or the Stroke Association, but there are so many that it really will be kind of up to you to have a search around. So you can flex your research skills in finding out this information from all the places that you might look. And some of them are specific to certain professions, others much more open, and it really is about the topic area, and they would be, you know, very welcoming of any discipline applying. So other fellowships, again, we're back to professional bodies, which we've talked about already. And another option that might be worth thinking about is the NIHR schools. So the schools are kind of a network. I don't know if you've come across them. There's one that's particularly focused on primary care. There's a second one that's focused on public health, and a third one that's focused on social care. So if any of the work that you're doing overlaps with those, then it might be worth investigating the kind of awards that they have. And again, they are often on quite a cycle, particularly the primary care. The School of Primary Care is quite established, has been for many years. And so they have quite a cycle of funding opportunities that come up. They have grants as well as fellowships, actually. And so it's worth seeing what are coming up there. And obviously you will, there are particular conditions that you have to be associated with one of those schools. So for example, both Southampton and Oxford are members of the NIHR School for Primary Care. So you would need to in some way be affiliated to one of the spokes of that school. So there's usually about 9 or 10 partners who've all clubbed together to make up that school. So you need to get your links in with one of them somewhere. And it may be that what you want to do actually is some kind of research visit, like a travel fellowship, or some kind of sort of a bit back to a smaller pot of money that might be about dissemination. So, you know, it's great if your original PhD gave you funds to do some good dissemination work, but that might not have ended up happening or been possible. So often that might be the next stage for you, is to really get your work out there. So you might be looking at something like that. Or conferences. So conferences can be a really good way to build up your CV, see how the research that you're doing is landing amongst your colleagues, obviously a way to network, and see if you can get collaborators on board for whatever your next big idea is. So there are some groups that will support you to go off to a conference. Again, often it'll be if you've been accepted to present, or it might be if you're attending for the very first time. So again, not surprisingly, worth looking into the specifics of those. And charities might also support you to attend conferences or make research visits. So those are some options. A lot of it really is about you going out and having good old forage around. But just to say, here are some sort of broad places to look at for funding opportunities. Do come and talk to the RDS, and we may be able to give you some ideas that we haven't given already. Do go and talk to your local ARCs, your applied research collaborations, or your BRCs, biomedical research centres. There are various funding databases. So this one's got about 150 directories in it, charities in it, for you to have a look around and see what aligns with your work. And also, as you'll have seen the stand before from Kappa, so do investigate them as well, an absolute wealth of information there. There's also more generic funding databases, so it's always worth having a look. And you might, depending on where your links are, so I'm sure Oxford and Portsmouth are the same, but in Southampton we get a research bulletin that comes out weekly from the university that has various opportunities. RDS also puts out a latest calls bulletin, which has very specifically health and social care related research calls and opportunities for you to look at. So lots and lots of places that you can find out information. So just as a final example, the RCN has its own list of funding sources for small grants, so that can be worth looking at. So that might be particularly helpful, not only if you're a nurse, but it just has a really nice long list of places to look for small grants, which looks like this. So tiny, don't expect you to read it, but just to say it's a wealth of information.